Alley. This is Sports and More with Dean Millard.
I can't imagine any scenario where they ran a playoff with fans. I think they would have to be just a television situation, because they would have to do it sooner than later. And I don't think the world is ready to put 20,000 people in a hockey rink right now, So I think if they did it, it would have to be more of a TV event, probably be in a fairly closed environment and something like that. That would be my guess anyway.
Hello there, and welcome to Sports and More, the podcast, episode 41. That was NHL agent Gerry Johannson speaking about the future of the NHL season. And we do not know a whole lot about what's going on with the NHL season, other than that they have contingency plans. There are some leagues that are looking at May. Personally, I think that's a little early, but we'll see. If we can get ahead and flatten this curve, then all the power to them. My name is Dean Millard, by the way, and this is a show where almost anything goes. The only two things we really stay away from are politics and religion. Politics most of the time, religion all the time, and we are coming to you from The Marsh in Podcast Alley if you are watching on YouTube or our various streams on social media. So really excited to bring you today's program with NHL agent Gerry Johannson. And here is the lineup. And if you're watching, I've got the Jays and Braves 92 World Series. I think this is game 2 going on the right screen. Left screen, I got the Bruins Canadians 1979 Adams Division Final. Man, those Montreal Canadiens teams were absolutely dominant. So we're going to talk with Gerry Johannson about being an agent from home right now. Thoughts from NHL players. The impact on contracts or free agencies if the season gets wiped out, the draft, etc. Life as an NHL agent, from an NHL agent, and what it's like for him on draft and deadline day with a bunch of his clients, GMs, and so much more. Our top 3 today is best or worst NHL contracts, and our poll question, both of those brought to you by Ultimate Franchise Fantasy Sports, is about a defenseman pairing that you would have if you were an NHL rookie. We'll give you some choices in just a little bit. So that's what we have going down for you. So let's get into our top 3, which is brought to you by Ultimate Franchise Fantasy Sports. Fantasy sports are great. They really are. I'm in a lot of different fantasy leagues, but now with Ultimate Franchise Fantasy Sports, it is realistic, more realistic than ever, man. It is out of this world. You will own one of only 31 professional fantasy hockey franchises in the world. You have a 23-man roster with a 27-player reserve list, a stockpile. Of course, you have daily roster moves, a really cool, unique playoff format. Most fantasy leagues don't get to the playoffs of the NHL. This one does, and there's a draft before the playoffs. It's so cool. And these aren't just players, they're digital assets. You use digital currency to buy and sell players. That's right. They are assets that you can purchase as prospects from scouts, which is another cool thing that they have, this scouting program, or you can sell them and include them in trades and make money that way. You can also make money by winning the league, which I was hoping to do. I was in a playoff position when, unfortunately, they ended the season. Now, there's only a few franchises left, so get your own by bidding right now at www.airauctioneer.com/UFF sports -NHL -fantasy -franchise -auction. If you're watching, it's right there on the screen. And just skip back if you need to get that one more time. You just have to open your free account at Air Auctioneer, make your bid, and you'll be notified if you are. So get in the game with Ultimate Franchise Fantasy Sports. So our top 3 is the best or worst. The Briz, 9 years, $51 million, bought out after 2 years, leaving Philly to pay him $23 million over 14 years. Yikes, there were some bad contracts for sure. So my list is there's going to be some names that were on that one as well. My honorable mention is Jeff Finger, the 4-year deal that he signed with the Toronto Maple Leafs for $14 million. He had played less than 100 games in the NHL, played just 105 with the Leafs, and there was all kinds of mentions that Cliff Fletcher then for the Leafs thought he was signing Kurt Sauer instead of Jeff Finger, and yeah, everybody was pretty surprised by that one. David Clarkson is an interesting one. 7 years, $36.75 million. 75% of it was guaranteed in signing bonus, equals basically being buyout proof. He only played 118 games with the Leafs. He had one season of 32 goals, and that was pretty much it before he signed the contract. And I remember the Edmonton Oilers really tried to sign David Clarkson, and Craig McTavish came in for his news availability that day on free agency, and I was there for Global Sports, and he's like, this is the one, this hurts one. This one got away. Well, you dodged a bullet with that one because Clarkson never lived up to that contract. The Briz, number 2 for me, 9 years, $51 million, bought out after 2 years, and as mentioned, has $23 million over 14 years owing. And Rick DiPietro takes the cake, 15-year contract, which is just insane for anybody to get a 15-year contract. $67 million. It was then bought out. He is paid $1.5 million per year until 2029. It's like the Bobby Bonilla. Every July 1st, Bobby Bonilla gets more money from the Mets. Same with DiPietro. Till 2029, he gets $1.5 million. He's getting it for another 9 years. Pretty amazing stuff for sure. Good for him. Anyway, he was doing a radio show in New York, and he was Humpty because he was hurt so often. His nickname was Humpty Dumpty, which I found quite funny. So send me your top 3 at Duck Millard on Twitter, and get more details about Ultimate Franchise Fantasy Sports at uffsports.com, where you own the game. And quickly at Podcast Alley, we will have one-timers with Gerry Johannson, NHL agent, who we're going to speak to right away. And we also have at the Cannabis 101 podcast, one-hitters and our interview with Hart Steinfeld of Sundial Cannabis. So you can check that all out at www.podcastalley.ca. All right, let's get to know our guest today, NHL agent Gerry Johannson, with the bio.
Time for the bio.
Gerry Johannson was born in Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, and as the son of a police officer, moved around a bit before settling in Swift Current and graduating high school in 1984. He was taken in the '84 draft by the Montreal Canadiens and played NCAA hockey at Lake Superior State University for 1 season before joining the New Westminster Bruins. After his playing career, he worked as an assistant GM and assistant coach with the Tri-City Americans of the Western Hockey League for 6 years, before joining the Sports Corporation Agency in Edmonton with Rich Winter in 1993. In 2012, he purchased the agency outright and now serves as the president and CEO, with clients such as Carey Price, Ryan Getzlaff, Colton Parayko, and Braden Point, to name just a few. According to the website puckpedia.com, Johannson has the 6th most active contracts, totaling more than $450 million. Gerry, it is great to welcome you to Sports and More, the podcast, in what is certainly strange times. You and I are a bit of neighbors, but we have to do this over the phone because we're all doing our part at physical and social distancing. How is life for you right now?
Well, it's been good, actually. I mean, it's been quiet. I travel a lot, so it's actually nice to spend some time at home. I'm not sure my wife is not getting sick of me right now, but I do get to the office. It's pretty quiet down there. But it's been nice actually to sort of settle down and just hunker down for a while.
Yeah, it's a weird sort of time right now that it is giving a lot of us that opportunity to stay home, spend time with the family, slow down a little bit. And, I don't want to do this for a long time, but it's not the worst thing in the world to be forced to take a little bit of a break every now and then.
No, Dean, you're right. It's just crazy how busy everybody is all the time. You're just running around, it seems. And, I know some people are really suffering during this time. It's tough for a lot of people, but, selfishly for me, it's a little tough in the hockey world moving forward, but for sure to be, spend time with your family and sort of settle down a little bit and not rush around all the time. It's probably good for us.
Yeah, what is unfortunately not good is what's happened to our business. Your business as an NHL agent has kind of grinded to a bit of a halt right now. What do you think as far as an NHL future for this season? If you had to put a percentage on it, what do you think it would be?
Well, if I'm an optimist by nature, so I'd say 50-50. I think that I do think that the league has sort of contingency plans if news turns positive, to try and have some sort of end of the season playoff type format. But like anybody in any business, I think you're hoping for something, but you're at the mercy of the gods, as they say. You're waiting for this whole world to sort of get a handle on this virus. So I think they have plans on it. I think they'd like to do something. But I think the priority for them is going to be to have a full season next year and make sure that whole season has, is off and running.
Is that the right, priority to have, to make sure that next season is taken care of? I know we all want a Stanley Cup playoff because it's, within sight right now. This is the time we would be watching the playoffs, but is that the right move to make sure next year is the priority?
Well, I think they owe it to themselves to at least have a plan for one, and whether it's practical or whether it's doable or whether it's even something that ultimately they want to do, I think it's smart to have a plan just in case, but it's such an odd time, if you were going to do it, it would certainly be unorthodox. It wouldn't be 7-game series, I can tell you that. So it would be something interesting and different. And of course, in sports, everybody's pretty traditional with how things are. So it would be different, but I think it's smart for them to have a plan at least.
Yeah, I think certainly I'd imagine anyway that there are contingency plans as you get closer to each date, and then okay, we're past that date, so we got to scrap that one and move on to the next one. I'm sure every professional league has those situations right now. You're talking to your clients. What are the players thinking right now as far as what they want to do?
Well, I think it's just the great unknown, so nobody really knows. And I think, depending on what they ask a guy, I think you could get a different answer. But generally speaking, hockey players are built to play hockey. They like to play. So I think if you actually said, okay, we're going to start a playoff now, I think the guys would jump into gear in 2 seconds. I think they'd be ready to go. But you know how it's no different than how people respond to this situation. Some people are scared and negative. Some people are more positive and not so worried. I think the players are similar to that when they think about the near term future of hockey and finishing the season. I think you sort of have it's all over the map a little bit.
Well, the worst thing that you could do is start the league up again and have something happen with an outbreak again, because then you're putting so many more people. So, like if I'm just using this as an example. Let's say they say May 15th is the date. Where you think you can do it, you might want to wait until May 30th or something like that. It's almost like you have to plan for the worst case scenarios because we could be facing them right now.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I can't imagine any scenario where they ran a playoff with fans. I think they would have to be just a television situation, because they would have to do it sooner than later. And I don't think the world is ready to put 20,000 people in a hockey rink right now, so I think if they did it, it would have to be more of a TV event, probably be in a fairly closed environment and something like that. That'd be my guess anyway.
That would be a strange animal to be watching the Stanley Cup playoffs with no crowd. If that's the only way we could get it, watching on TV, the hockey will still be the same. It will just sound so much differently, wouldn't it?
It's like a laugh track on those comedy shows. You'd have to have a fake crowd in the background or something. But I mean, it would be out of the box if they did it. It would certainly be, different. And whether they, it's one thing to plan; it's another thing to actually execute it. So, we're probably a long way from the plan on paper and actually doing it. Even if you're able to do it, would they do it? I think that's probably two separate discussions.
So. There's a lot of people that think that this is just not going to happen. We're just not going to have a Stanley Cup champion this season. I hope it doesn't come to that. But if it does, what are the contingency plans for, bonus structures in contracts? Because, there were players that were on pace to hit some of those bonuses. Do you know as an agent, and have you guys had these discussions about what happens in that situation?
Well, there's two things, two parts to that. Number one is most players don't have performance bonuses. So the only players eligible for performance bonuses these days with the new CBA are entry-level players or players like over 35 or who have come off long-term injury. So it's actually a really small number of guys that actually have bonuses. And the playoffs, frankly, the players don't get paid for the playoffs. I mean, they receive some bonus money, but nothing, comparative to what they make during the year. So more or less, the players play for free, during the playoffs anyway. And then, but where it gets tricky is, because the season ended shortly, this can affect waivers. It can affect salary arbitration. It can, your days of playing in the NHL. So I think they're already starting to work on sort of transition rules on how that would affect players in different ways. But that's more into the middle of the CBA, not really on the ice stuff.
Okay, so the minority of the players would be affected by any kind of performance bonuses. I'm just using McDavid as an example. If he had a clause in his contract of 100 points, I don't know about that, but the list would be small. The bigger concern you're talking about is time in the league as far as waivers. If a guy doesn't reach a certain amount and he could have, is that where you're going with that?
Yeah, different rules like that would affect way more players. But really, Connor McDavid doesn't have a point bonus in his contract. So, and in the playoffs, there's no bonuses.
Right.
So, if you did a quasi playoff of some sort, it wouldn't really affect anybody. All of the stuff that would affect players is really, sort of in the back pages of our agreement with the NHL. And it's been worked on before. They've done it, these transition rules during lockouts and things like that, where they've come up with it. So they've done it before. It'll affect more players, but not in any way, unless you were the player or his family or his agent, you wouldn't even know.
Okay, it's interesting. And this is, I know you're a hockey agent, but I was looking at Major League Baseball. If they were to scrap the season, I wonder what would happen to a guy like Mookie Betts, who was just traded to the Dodgers and is going to be a free agent. But that's not a situation that hockey is looking at because we've completed, most of the season. So the only thing that they would miss out on is I guess the playoff money for winning at the end of it.
Yeah, 100%, exactly. And that, I mean, I can tell you, none of the guys go and play in the playoffs for the money.
Yeah.
It's not. If you ask most players, they couldn't tell you what they get for playoff bonuses. They wouldn't even know probably, But if you did have a playoff at some point, it would affect like the July 1 deadline because you'd have to obviously move that. There'd be salary arbitration things, different things like that would interfere with a late playoff. So, I'm sure they could figure it out if they put their minds to it.
That playoff money is interesting. It was a big deal at one point for players, and when salaries weren't what they are now. But with the salaries they're making, you're right. It's probably a drop in the bucket. But you do bring up a good point, Gerry, and that's free agency. I know we don't want to think about it, but there always is contingency plans. Are there target dates for when free agency would happen if the season is going past July 1st? I mean, I saw there was a report on TSN that was, I think it was Pierre LeBrun or Darren Dreger, who said from the players' perspective, they wanted to go right through and have free agency in October. Now, this was some players. I'm not saying all of them, but that has to be a bit of a moving target right now of when your players will become free agents.
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, right now we're all planning on just the regular dates, but for sure, if you did have an extended season with a late playoff, all of those dates would have to be shuffled for sure. Because it'd be hard to have the free agency on July 1st and you're still playing in the playoffs at the end of July. That'd be a little difficult. So I think there would be some tweaking, to say the least, to the rule book and the dates for sure.
So are the players like all of us right now, just in a big unknown? I know as many as they can are working out, but what's the mindset for the player right now? Because these guys are they're thoroughbreds, man. They're Ferraris, and you just don't just turn the key and go. You got to work up to something. How are they handling it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think Braden Point has it figured out. He's got a pool and he's living in Florida right now, so I think he's probably in pretty good shape. But you're right, Dean. These guys are creatures of habit. It's funny. Like I notice it in the summer a lot. Like by the time early August starts to hit, the guys are just ready to go. Like they're sick of training and they don't want to golf anymore. They want to go play hockey. And no different than the end of the year. You have your exit meeting. You say goodbye to the guys, you pack up your bag and you leave, and none of that's happened. It just sort of ended. And so it is a shock to their system because they've been more or less on the same schedule since they were kids, playing, at more or less a very similar schedule. So yeah, it's certainly a different world for them.
Are you talking to players more now than you normally would, or less?
Probably about the same. I think generally during the season we're talking to them, sort of based on what's going on in their world, based on their hockey and their schedule. And now we're just sort of checking in, and frankly, everybody is doing the same thing as we are. They're just basically hunkered down at home with their families. So, we talk a little bit about what we're talking about, what might happen, or what you heard here, heard there. But really, there's not a lot of specifics to discuss with them. So we're just checking in and make sure they're okay.
And as you mentioned, it must be strange for them because this is the time everybody gears up for, and we're all shut down. But the guys that are, like you said, Braden Point has a pool, and whether you're bench pressing your dog or you're working out in your own gym, you have to be ready to be able to ramp it up. I guess now it's kind of just maintaining because you don't want to ramp up too early.
Exactly. And I think these guys are all pretty smart. And you know what they are? They're all great athletes now. I mean, all these guys are tip-top shape. So I have a hard time thinking any of them would be out of shape. But it goes to another thing. If you did have a playoff, you'd have to have a training camp of some sort because the guys aren't skating. So I don't think they get out of condition, but you certainly need a couple of weeks to get the guys back up to speed on the ice for sure, because they no matter even in the optimistic scenario, they would have been off the ice for months,
right?
So you'd have to have some sort of training camp and then a playoff, and then that would lead right into the start of the season again. So whether that's doable or not, it would certainly be strange.
Do you I think as you mentioned earlier, I don't think a 7-game series is going to happen if there is a playoff. Do you have a preference? We had a poll question last week: 1 game, 3 games, 5 games, or no cup. Some people just want 16 wins or bust. What would be your preference? If would you like to see expanded teams this year because it's been so strange because they didn't get to finish the season? Do you have a preference of what you'd like to see other than 7 games?
Well, I think if you're going to, the only thing is if you're going to do it different, you might as well really do it different. You know what I mean? It's not going to be the same no matter what you do. So you might as well try something a little out of the box, and so, yeah, I think if you expanded it a little bit, certainly teams like, Chicago and Montreal and New York Rangers were close, so they could probably get into some sort of play-in scenario. Probably look more like an NCAA bracket than a 7-game grind that is normally the playoffs. But I think if you did decide to go forward, I think it's going to be so unorthodox. You might as well embrace it and just try everything you can because it's going to be different. And who knows, maybe something in that might work that you implement moving forward. Whether it's extra TV cameras and just more interactive stuff with the players or whatever. But just to really, if you're going to do it, you might as well. If you're going to try something, then now would be the time if we got back on the ice.
Well, you know what? You bring up such a good point in that I never really kind of grabbed onto is that it's different anyway. The playoffs should have started, in tomorrow, I think was the date that they were going to start. But this is different, so why not? And you know what? I know purists would hate it, Gerry, but I can't imagine what a one game like a NCAA basketball style format with however many teams you had. Just if you were ever going to do it for 1 year, this would be the year. I can't imagine the intensity of every one of those games, what they would be like. I know it won't happen, but I'm just thinking pie in the sky.
I agree with you, Dean. I mean, it would be an asterisk beside the Cup winner anyway.
Yeah.
You know, it would always be considered to be not necessarily a real Stanley Cup, I guess, but yeah, if you're going to try different, just embrace it and run with it. And if you do that, maybe there's something that you try that works, some part of it that works that you implement moving forward that maybe is really entertaining. Like the outdoor game was sort of out of the box thinking for the first one, and that's become a pretty cool event. So I'm sure there's something you could try that would probably stick. In terms of how you shot it or how you interacted with the players during the game or who knows what, but all that stuff.
Well, in bigger picture, normal season, would you be in favor of play-in games, almost wild card games? Major League Baseball has found success with it. Now, albeit they have much less teams than the NHL in the playoffs, but would you be in favor of the ninth place team and the eighth place team playing off to get into the playoffs of each conference?
Well, I would say, I kind of in favor of that because it's just so tight. Like most years, as we all know, there's there's no such thing as a safe lead. So there's so many competitive teams. Largely it's momentum. If you get a little momentum at the right time of year, it can make a big difference. No different than St. Louis last year. So I think the more opportunity you have teams have a fighting chance at it, I think it would be a good thing. So I'd be in favor of that for sure.
Okay, I want to chat a little bit about how you became an agent, and for people that don't know, we mentioned it in the bio, but you were a draft pick of the Montreal Canadiens, your favorite team, one of your favorite teams growing up. You played some hockey, some NCAA. What was the transition to becoming an agent like for you?
Well, actually, I was before I didn't even think to become an agent. It didn't even cross my mind. Actually, I had an agent. I still didn't even consider it. But I was working with New Westminster Bruins had moved to the Tri-Cities area, so they became the Tri-City Americans. And I went down and was working there for 5 or 6 years. And what I was really good at was recruiting. So I was out recruiting players. In those days, you could just bring players in. You didn't have a draft. And, if a player in Boston wanted to come play for Tri-City Americans, he could. So I was at one point traveling all over recruiting players to play junior hockey. And when I left Tri-Cities, my good friend and business partner, Scott Bonner, introduced me to Rich Winter, who was had a fairly real established agent here right in Edmonton. And but his client list was Czechoslovaks. He had Dominic Hasek and Peter Bondra and, a bunch of guys, but he didn't have any Western Canadian guys. So my first day on the job, I think I drove to Fort McMurray and met with Chris Phillips. Nice. So as he was a young guy then, I didn't get him, but I basically knew where all the hockey players were. So it was an easy transition for me. I basically hit the ground running, and it sort of worked out from there.
That's awesome. I often ask guys, I had Colby Armstrong on last week about, maybe their first goal or something like that. Jeff Odgers, I asked him about his first fight. So your first client that you landed, that you brought in, what was that like for you and who was it?
Well, you know what? It's funny because I think my first year I probably ended up with 25 players.
Wow.
Because I knew I had a lot of contacts. I sort of knew everybody. But I think as I recall, my first player that was drafted and signed a contract, or at least was drafted, was a guy named Michael Grady. I wonder what he's doing these days. If he hears this, he should call me. But I haven't changed my number. But yeah, it's in our business, you never really know, what you have. Time goes by, and all of a sudden, I have Carey Price. He's a great guy, nice family, really good player, but you don't expect him to be maybe one of the all-time great goalies. You're not surprised when they are, but you don't count on that.
Right.
So it's probably the most fun part of our business is watching our players, develop, like, a Brendan Gallagher or Braden Point or Ryan Getzlaff or Colton Braco. Lots of stories like that, that it's fun to be part of that.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I mean, you look at Carey Price, and he was, obviously a very highly touted goaltender. And then the other side is Colton Parayko, who was a late bloomer. So, as an agent, you can't just be like, I'm only taking first round guys, or I'm only looking at, late bloomers. You have to cast a bit of a wide net.
Yeah, you do, and you have to have a good network of people to help you make sure you know what's going on. And like I said, if you come to our office, all of our pro players are on the wall. And for sure, Dean, it's happened 50-50. I'm looking at Braden Coburn in my office right now, but he was a first overall Bantam draft pick. He was a first round NHL draft pick. He's had a really good career. But then you look at Colton Parayko, very similar kind of player, but he was nowhere at 16 or even 17. He got a tryout in Fort McMurray, and we were high-fiving. So it's just different. And, so you never underestimate a player's upside, because they're growing and they're getting smarter, and they get opportunity at different times. And, it's just that that's just the process. But it is the fun part in hindsight, especially.
No doubt. We saw Tom Cruise portray an agent in a very famous Hollywood movie. And it kind of portrayed the agent business as cutthroat. That was NFL, but is it more friendly than that?
Well, let's put it this way: I'd rather be Bob Sugar than Jerry Maguire. If that makes any sense.
Okay.
But you know what? It's not. I wouldn't. I mean, it's collegial. Like it's hockey, so you're all. I can't really speak to other sports, but I know all our competitors more or less. There's always new guys that come in you're not that familiar with, but you're in it's a pretty tight circle. So I would say it's pretty collegial in terms of how we get along, but it's super competitive. Like, you have to do a good job, and, ultimately players can work with whoever they want. So you never really own a player like in the draft scenario where a team drafts you. Even in the Bantam draft, they can draft you. You don't have to agree. They can just draft you, and then they own your rights. Mm-hmm. And in our business, the only way we keep a player is to do a good job for them. So it's competitive, but I think it's also the fun part of our business. If you do a good job, then you'll be rewarded, and if you don't, then someone else might take your player. But that's the way it should be.
That's right. With that in mind, was there one particular client that you worked really hard, like the hardest client that you had to land, or something like that? Is there one that maybe sticks out more than others?
No, it's funny. It's a lot of work. You're traveling a lot. You're dealing with people, so those are sort of the foundation parts of our business. But in terms of, especially and I had a lot of success early in this business, and I sort of realized that it's more just it's a relationship business. So you either have a relationship with the player or you don't. And especially in hindsight, I can see that generally happens sooner than later. So if I look back on it, the guys that we ended up with, we generally seemed to be the right person at the right time for that player. And other guys who we missed, maybe we were just too late, or we just weren't in that circle, or whatever. So it's we work hard for our guys, but I have never really had it really hustle for a player. There's been a couple of times where it's been competitive, so you just do that part. But it's just been more of a. It seems more like a natural progression. If you know what you're doing, then certainly you get the players you should get, I guess.
Well, it's almost like you just can't let the players that sign with somebody else. You just have to be like, okay, move on, and you can't really dwell on it because you have current clients, and there's always new players coming in. So you kind of you can't dwell on the players that you don't sign, I guess. Yes.
That's exactly right, Dean. 100%. You get the players you get, and you never know. Like, if people knew the drafts, they would only have to be 1 or 2 rounds because that's all the players you would need. But the best scouts in the world are wrong way more than they're right. So it's, there is there's a sort of an element. I mean, all these young guys are growing, developing, and there's lots happening with them. And so a kid like Colton Parayko, who just blossoms into a super player, or Brendan Gallagher, or Braden Point, guys you wouldn't expect at a certain age to be good, all of a sudden become great. And there's just as many or more stories of guys you thought would be great at a young age and then just never quite got their feet under them and sort of leveled off. But that's the competitive world of sports.
Well, and convincing an NHL player to become your client is just the first step. Then you get to start negotiating contracts, and that's just the beginning of getting the player. And now you have to represent them. Past or present, toughest GM you've had to negotiate with?
Well, I would say, I think in our business we generally have good rapport with everybody. So I don't think you necessarily have tough GMs. I think you have tough situations.
Okay.
So I think it's more about a player with a certain expectation combined with a certain club and a certain scenario and a certain reality. And you mix all that into a pot and you get a really tough scenario, and I think that's more common, but the GMs, I mean, we understand what they're trying to do. So I think as long as you know what the team's objective is, and we get paid to do that, to know that stuff, we get past first and second base pretty quick, and we're because we understand what they can do, what they can't do. It's a bit of a rookie agent move is you sort of overmanage your player and think you're going to hit a home run every time you're up at the plate, and that just isn't real. It's just, we get some home runs, but we hit a lot of singles too. And, so I think if you understand your team you're dealing with and the realities that they're dealing with, you can avoid a lot of that conflict.
We always hear players, in a contract year, if you will, say, "Oh, I'm just leaving that up to my agent." So that's when you're kicking in, and is it several? Like, I guess every situation is different, but I'd imagine it's not just one meeting that you're having. It's hundreds of phone calls, and then you maybe get to meet. I'd imagine.
I mean, that's a good line for a player to say. It's a really smart thing. We encourage our guys to say that. But we probably spend 80% of our time talking to our client and 20% of our time talking to the team during a contract negotiation. The biggest thing is to educate your player to know what's what, because everybody has different expectations. Everybody has a little bit of a different reality when they look at something. And so our job is to make sure the player and their core group, it could be their family or their wife or whatever, are all on the same page, and that when we go into a negotiation, it's important to be prepared and make sure our player understands what the reality of his situation is. And then if we've done that work, then the next step of finishing up a contract or getting one done is a lot easier, because we're sort of cutting to the chase. But you don't really want your player to figure it all out as you're negotiating the contract. You sort of want to get that part done first and then go forward with the deal.
And I imagine at one point it was pretty much just agent talking with player. And things have evolved now, especially when you're dealing with young players, you're dealing with that family as far as the parents, things like that. And then as the player gets to maybe another level in the NHL, you're involving a different kind of a family, wife, kids, things like that. So I'd imagine negotiations and things like that have changed over time as family life becomes sometimes more important than hockey life.
100%. Yeah, because you got to think of it too. It's not you think of a contract as just like a piece of paper that, okay, here's what I'm getting paid, but really it reflects that player's entire life. So there's a lot that goes into it that's not just about money or about term or about those things. There's a lot of other things that go into it, So you really have to make sure that, because unlike most businesses where the business is sort of separate from even me, my company is a little bit different than me personally. But these athletes, they are their company. There's no separating the two, So it's it's pretty personal. So you have to make sure that their inner circle, which is pretty tight, no matter what. And you're right. It's parents. It's a best buddy. It's maybe a teammate that's an influencer or a wife or whatever. it's family, kids, the whole nine yards. So it's really important that it's a very inclusive process, that because really, it's their life and their family that we're really representing.
Are there package deals? Like, is there ever a situation where two guys are like, "Hey, we want to play together. Let's do this." Two of your clients, does that ever happen?
I think it's happened sort of in theory. I think that it's really important, though, when you're in those situations, that each player has their own business and has to take care of themselves, and so maybe we're always pitching GMs on all sorts of crazy ideas, and they listen to us. I fully expect that they might actually listen to us 10% of the time, but we got lots of ideas for them. So, I'm sure if you were a GM, listen to every crazy agent in the world, you'd have lots of stories to tell. But again, it's those are a little hard to pull off because players, everything's a moving target. How old they are, where they're at, what their team's doing, what other teams doing. So deals like that are tricky to pull off. But I'm sure it's been done. I've never really done one like that, but I'm sure it's happened a handful of times over the years.
All right. So this is a really, a people person. So a lot of people thought at one point, had to be a lawyer to become an agent. But I think the biggest, I'm not saying it doesn't help, but I think the biggest thing, it seems to me, is having people skills to be an agent, being able to, gain people's trust and provide a service. So kind of take us through how you land an agent. Is it just hanging out in rinks?
Yeah, well, basically, you have to get the player first. Otherwise, you could be the best agent in the world, and if you have no players, I don't think it really counts. So, and no different than if you have a bunch of players that don't know what you're doing, you're not going to last very long. So, it's a combination. Really, what it is, hockey is a pretty closed circle. Like if you go to the draft every year in the NHL, it's funny because, the entire NHL sits on the floor of the arena.
Yeah.
And it's almost embarrassing. If there's a new guy and there's literally about 1,500 people on the floor of the arena, if there's a new guy, everybody's looking, who's the new guy? So it's a pretty tight circle. So I think it's like anything. If you build a network and people trust you, and the only way you build trust is by doing a good job over time, then, that's what our business is really about. So we don't really cold call players. I'd say 99% of the players we get all come from some sort of referral, like most businesses grow, but that's really what it is. And so it's also a really good way to grow your business because, you're getting, referrals from existing clients who are happy, and it just sort of, it's a nice way to sort of, grow the business. So it's really about networking and doing a good job. Doing a good job for your lesser players is probably as important as anything. A lot of our good players go to, Canadian University, or they go play in the East Coast League. So if you want to have integrity as a company, you do have to make sure you treat all your players. You can't treat them equally, but you can treat them all fairly. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So an average day, how many players, assuming that the NHL is on and we're not in quarantine, but how many players do you think you would talk to in person? Because I know you do travel a lot, or on the phone in an average day, I guess, before their games.
Well, probably texting is the biggest thing right now. Yeah. So we're basically watching we don't watch every game, but we're every night we're looking at every score in every league, and we're checking in on our players. So what we're looking for is some special performance, or a player that didn't play or maybe got injured, or we focusing on players that are struggling a little bit for whatever reason. So our attention, when our players are playing great and their team's winning, and we have very little to do. Everything's great. It's generally when things are tricky. So maybe an injury, maybe a player that's getting traded or might get traded, or a player that's trying to break into a lineup and is sort of in and out. We have a tendency to spend a little bit more time focusing on those guys, because if everything's going good on the ice, they're generally pretty happy.
Mm-hmm. I guess same question for NHL management personnel, because it's not always the GM strictly that you talk to. I'm sure there's different people, but whether it's texting or chatting, does that happen daily with those types as well?
Yeah, basically, yeah. We're generally in touch with GMs. Like I've talked to a lot of GMs in this last 3 weeks, you know, and same thing. Like some teams, it's funny. Like, you know, I think we have 5 Montreal Canadiens right now, you know, and 0 San Jose Sharks. So I would speak to Mark Bergevin, you know, more than I would, you know, San Jose. So, you know, it sort of ebbs and flows like that. You know, you have a tendency to do business more with the teams where your players are. But then in the draft and the free agency, it sort of opens up again. So you're talking to everybody. So it's, you know, like we get to know the teams pretty well, and the depth of their organization too. So you're talking to the GM, the assistant GM, the area scout, the head scout, you know. So it's the entire network, and they're getting information from us, and we're sharing information with them. So it's a pretty balanced relationship, actually.
How about draft day? What is draft day like for an agent? You know, I don't know how many guys you might have at an average draft, but what's that like for you?
Well, it's a little bit like a contract negotiation. You spend a lot of time preparing your guys before the draft. That is critical. So, you know, because again, if it goes, you know, everybody wants to get drafted higher just from a human nature perspective, sort of an ego perspective, including us.
Yeah.
But as you learn, you know, the draft is a very poor indicator of future success. Obviously, more first-round picks play than seventh-round picks. But and even the Western Hockey League draft is a big deal for us. That's probably in some ways a bigger deal for us than the NHL draft. You know, so it's really just about the players understanding that, you know, there's two kinds of players, the guys that play and guys that don't. How you get there, if you're going to be a player, really, do you care how you get there? If you're does Colton Parayko care that he never got drafted into the Bantam draft?
Right.
You know, so does Dustin Penner care that he never got drafted in the NHL? You know, not really. So it's just a matter of making sure the players have a perspective and they don't get hitched to the wrong wagon. You know, like all of a sudden the draft is the indicator of their success. Well, it's not. You know, it could be part of it, but it certainly doesn't define the player. So I think it's just important to keep all this stuff in perspective.
Well, and I think that's something, you know, when you're a 17 or 18-year-old kid, it's hard to understand that, I'd imagine. So, you know, we all know teenagers are you know, changing with maturity and things like that, and that might be a harder thing to get across. Now, some kids are much more mature, but to them, that draft is everything. So it's really important to try to get that message to them, isn't it?
100%, and their families and their inner circle,
right? And
they're competitive. So you know, you can't be a hockey player if you're not competitive. So right away, you've got one, you know, sort of foot in the bucket because you want to do better. And you know, and the draft is also one of the few things that other people in your world can notice. So you have your inner circle, but then you have your uncles and your buddies and your beer drinking friends and all these other guys that don't really understand the process because they couldn't possibly understand the process. So when a draft hits, it really does affect your sort of wider group. So if you get drafted high, it's like, hey, great job, way to go, that's awesome. And if you don't get drafted, everybody says, what happened? Like, oh, it's too bad. I thought you were getting drafted. You know, so the players have to deal with a lot in terms of fallout, you know, from these events, good or bad, you know. And so the more educated they are to the reality of it, the much better they're able to handle it. And that's where we, again, by the time the draft hits, we're just sitting there like everybody else. Our work is more or less done.
Right. So
we, you know, if we've done our job right, we've prepared them for the, you know, the sort of the question mark of it all. You know, what does it really mean, and what doesn't it mean, and what's important and what's not. Braden Point's a third-round draft pick. It wasn't fun. We knew we should have went higher.
Yep.
Now, was it stressful sitting there for hours waiting for him to get picked? Sure. It would have been easier if he was the first overall pick. Yeah, it would have been a lot easier, you know. So, but that's why we're part of the inner circle, because we get it and we've been through it, and we're there to share that experience with the families and make sure they're prepared.
Yeah. One of the I remember talking to a scout, and he said riding home from the draft on the bus from the arena to the hotel in I think it was Ryan Nugent-Hopkins draft year 2011. And he said just the sad look on all the faces of the kids that were riding on the bus that thought they were going to go number one. And like you said, Braden Point is just a perfect example. Colton Parayko, same thing. And I guess you're dealing with different things. Maybe you have a client that's in contention to go first overall, so his expectations are different than a client that's a second to third round prospect. So being an agent, you have to be a little bit flexible too.
Oh, yeah, success is relative to everybody. Yeah, everybody sees it different, you know, and that's why each player is individual. You know, a lot of times on paper, it looks the same, like two players will follow a similar career path. But I promise you that how they've dealt with it and how they've, sort of managed that process and adjusted to it is completely different because it's so personal. You know, some guys are just low key guys. Some guys are a little more, stressed out guys. You know, some guys have, a really balanced approach. Some guys, are a little more, excited about it or excitable, so, personality plays a lot into it. So again, the better you know your player, the more trust you've built up, then the better position you are to advise them. Because I tell guys all the time that, hockey isn't the way you think it is. It's the way it is. And those can be two different things, so you ain't changing the way it is because that's just the way it is. And how you think it is, that's probably the thing you want to work on to make sure you know what the process actually is about.
So that's draft day, which is, a different animal than some other things because, the majority of your clients that are eligible for the draft are expecting to be drafted. Trade deadline is probably a different animal because not every one of your clients is expected to be traded. I guess what's the lead up to trade deadline like and then the actual day?
Yeah, that's, it's kind of like, the truth is the trade deadline day, the poor media, we keep in real close contact with media too. We have quite the relationship too as well.
Sure.
But it's so anticlimactic because most of the deals that are done by the time July 1 hits or whatever the date is generally have already been done. Mostly, so even and sort of the same, scenario applies for us that we generally know who our players are that are going to be potentially moved. So, we're usually not surprised. I mean, there's the odd guy that could be a piece of a puzzle that you didn't see coming. But I always tell people trades are generally a good thing. Like it's a reset button. It's a way to, like in the Western Hockey League, trades are excellent because you can fix problems, you can readjust. In the NCAA, there's no trades. So once you make a commitment to that organization, you're there. You get a red shirt, but that means sitting out a year. That's no fun. So trades are generally a nice little balance. And again, more often than not, like sort of 19 out of 20 times, we're pretty aware of our guys that are potentially going to be moved. So they are somewhat prepared for it.
Is it, I guess it depends on the player, but some can be really nervous and anxious about it. And others can be like, hey, c'est la vie, right? And I guess it depends on what situation they are in their career. Some guys want to get traded because they want to go to a contender. So they could be nervous to want to get traded.
Yeah, for sure. And, it's funny because trades are sort of like such a part of the business that I think everybody accepts it. I think when it happens to you, it's always a shock. I think it's because you literally this is just literal. You're literally packing up your stuff and leaving more or less the same day. So, you might have had plans to go for dinner with your neighbor, your kids had a hockey game in 3 days. You're shutting all of that down. You're packing up your stuff and you are leaving. And then your wife or someone in your family has to take care of everything else. So when you get traded, like you pack up and leave right away. So it's sort of it's a shock just on that front. But I think also it's just an accepted part of the business. So as much as you might be shocked in the moment, I think all of our guys understand that's just a reality.
Yeah, you're right. Maybe that first trade for a player is kind of a little bit shocking, but guys that are going to contenders or whatnot are, by that time it's happened so often in their career. I guess it's probably the young players that you have to spend a little bit more time with.
Yeah, and it happens to everybody. Someone has been traded, and everybody in the room, somebody's been traded there or asked for a trade, or so it might not happen to you. It doesn't happen very often, actually, but what happens. So it's just something that you consider to be normal. Mm-hmm. But still, yeah, when you're all of a sudden 1 minute you're a St. Louis Blue, and the next minute you're a Boston Bruin, that's a bit of a jolt to the system. I don't care who you
are. Is it an odd call to make to ask for a trade for your client?
Yeah, that's a whole other thing too. Again, which, if you do your job right, you're never really asking for a trade. Generally, trades have to be benefit for everybody.
Right.
So, again, it's not always like this, but if you're, if a player wants to be traded or a team wants to trade a player, there's usually a reason for it. And if it's a no good reason, we try to solve that issue internally from the player side at least. And if it's an actual issue, then usually the team is more willing to consider it. And so that's what you're trying to do at the end of the day is try to make it work for everybody. I think that's a lot of what we do as agents too, is we try to find a balance, because our players are all looking for good situations.
Right.
And money's part of that, but there's a lot more to it than you might think in terms of, being a competitive athlete. Money's important, but there's other things that are equally as important.
Right. And you never have to, can't burn a bridge, because you have no idea when your next client is going to be dealing with that GM. So being civil with things is, obviously, people get emotional and heated at times, I'm sure, but you always have to remember when you're going to work with that person next again.
100%. And it's a competitive game, so everybody's emotional. Like,
yeah. I
got a rule. You don't call a GM after a loss. I'll wait a week or two until they win a game before I call them, just because it's a lot easier phone call. So, and our players are emotional. The teams are emotional. Like, these guys are all invested heavily in this process. And you really respect that, because that's what makes it exciting, is that people aren't just doing a job. They're into it, So, you have to understand that element and manage it as well from both the team's end and the players' end. We get a few GMs calling us fired up about our players, and we don't necessarily pass that message along until everybody's had a chance to take a time out and give it some more thought. So we really are the in-between guys.
You're kind of the mediator almost. I want to wrap with just a couple questions about two of your clients. Gerry Price, just a wonderful role model, and great career, and I love that recently was named the top goaltender by his peers, the NHLPA. There were people that were wondering about Gerry Price because the team hasn't been very good, so the goaltenders numbers are going to be a little bit higher. But he seems like a guy that takes everything in stride.
Yeah, Gerry, I have so much respect for him. I've known him since he was probably 15 years old, and I mean, he's just an awesome guy. Like, he really is. And I can't imagine a tougher job in all of sports than being a goalie for the Montreal Canadiens. Yeah. I mean, that's got to be right up there. And he handles it just the way he is. He's just so mature and so balanced and so rooted in his life that he handles it. And it doesn't mean he doesn't get, fired up some days, and, like everybody, but boy, it's, and Montreal's been great too to deal with. Actually, they've been excellent, But it isn't an easy job, and he handles it, so well.
And then you have a guy in Braden Point, and we've talked about him, and he's in Tampa, and he's kind of not the opposite, but different than Gerry Price, where he's not the face of the franchise, but so successful. My first memory of Braden Point was the 2012 WHL playoffs, where I think he had like a goal every second game or something like that as a 15-year-old, and a bunch of them were game winners. And I remember Mike Vandenberg, an assistant coach for the Warriors at the time, telling me, like, this guy is so good. If he wasn't wearing a face mask, you would have no idea he was 15 years old. And he slips. I think the Lightning did a good job scouting him and not telling anybody they could about him. But this is a guy who, as a World Junior was dominant, and as a Tampa Bay Lightning player. And another example of, you don't have to be drafted in the first round, isn't it?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, and Braden's just a phenomenal guy and a player. Like, he's another guy. He's a hockey savant. Like, he plays hockey, and that's all he does, and it's impressive. Like, and on your comment about, I think I mentioned this to somebody in Tampa, or it might have been a similar situation on a different team, but it doesn't matter. But I said, wow, great job scouting, getting Braden Point in the third round. And the comment was basically that if I was so smart, I would have taken him in the first round. I wouldn't have waited to the third round, which is a great line, because it just shows you everybody's sort of guessing. Even the smartest guy in the world is taking a guess. Because how competitive is Braden Point? How competitive is Gerry Price? How competitive is Brendan Gallagher? You don't really know till you put him into the game, at a different level. And but Braden, and similarly to all of our players, they're really competitive guys, and they they're not afraid to compete, and they relish in it. And and Braden is a perfect example.
Yeah, it's such a great point. Why didn't Hawk and Anderson recommend all those guys for Detroit to go in the first round too? Right. So
it might even have been Ken. I think it might have been Ken Hollenline. It's one of those guys who said that if I was so smart, I would have taken him in the first round, not the 8th round. Somebody like that. But it's a really smart line.
Yeah.
That just was, I get credit for being smart, but really, it might just as much luck. But hey, they scouted the player. They took him where they took him. And if you get a guy like that, like I think Braden Point was unanimously the first overall pick that draft by the certain group of media. So, it's a heck of a player. And that's why the draft is so important. Because, just because you're a 7th round pick or didn't get drafted or, whatever, it doesn't mean that, that's it for you. It just means that, that's just your path and you just got to accept it and keep playing.
No doubt. Gerry, this has been a really fun conversation. When we're allowed to, we'll get together and do this in person. But for right now, stay safe, stay healthy, and, hopefully something happens and we see some playoff hockey this year.
Well, that sounds good, Dean. Thanks for having me on, and definitely we'll connect up when we can.
Cameron used to sing a lot, but he stopped when his dad yelled, "Shut up."
This is the Sports and More podcast with Dean Millard.
Cut the gas when his girlfriend yelled, "Slow down." Cameron used to read, but he closed the sleeve when his friend yelled, "Hey, geek." Cameron's changed. Cameron's ashamed. Cameron's afraid. Cameron used to laugh.
There, that was a lot of fun. Good conversation with NHL agent Gerry Johannson of the Sports Corporation. We'll have one-timers with Gerry where we get to know him a little bit more in a couple of days after this episode is released. So check that out at sportsandmore.ca. I'm just always curious about the goings on of an agent and the relationship. And, it sounds like it's maybe a little exaggerated from Jerry Maguire as far as the competitiveness, but it is competitive for sure. And, you always think, listen, you're in contact with these GMs or management personnel so much, you're going to have arguments. You just can't take it personally. There's been a lot of coaches that I've covered over the years in my media career that got really mad at me for different things. Didn't affect my relationship long term with them. I've had just different arguments or disagreements with lots of guys that I'm still in contact with and consider to be friends. So you just can't take it personally when something gets up. I mean, Brian Burke has that legendary story that he told Guy Flaming and I on the Pipeline show about the Sedin trade, that him and Rick Dudley were going back and forth, and they were swearing at each other and yelling and screaming and emotional. You just have to persevere because you're going to have to deal with these people again, so you don't really want to burn a bridge there. So, all right, before we go, let's get to the ultimate franchise fantasy sports poll question, and it is, you are an NHL rookie defenseman. Choose your defense partner. You've got Bobby Orr, Paul Coffey, Nick Lidstrom, or Larry Robinson. I don't think people realize how good Larry Robinson maybe was. He was a backbone of those Canadian dynasty teams. Listen, Lafleur, Lemaire, Shutt, they're all dynamic. But Larry Robinson was tough, scored double-digit goals a lot. He was really, really good. He's on the left side of the screen against the Boston Bruins right now. If you're watching, you got the Blue Jays and the Braves. Good on Sportsnet, good on NHL.com, the center ice package to be putting these old games on for us to have something to watch. TSN as well. They had Orioles, California Angels from 95. I bet you that's a no-hitter from Nolan Ryan. I'm just guessing. because he had so many of them. So anyway, our poll question is, what defenseman would you take if you were a NHL rookie and you could choose Bobby Orr, Paul Coffey, Nick Lidstrom, or Larry Robinson? Right now, a dead heat. Literally, the voting just changed. Just over 100 votes. You have 6 days left. Vote at Duck Millard on Twitter. Bobby Orr, Nick Lidstrom, both with 39 point. Oh, it just changed again. Nick Lidstrom with 39.6%. Bobby Orr 38.6%. Paul Coffey bringing in 12.9%. And Big Bird Larry Robinson only at 8.9%. But as mentioned, he was dominant. So I unfortunately didn't get to see Bobby Orr play, but I had an opportunity to sit in the very first row at Northlands Coliseum, or I guess it was Rexall then, for a Detroit Red Wing game. My wife and I had like first row seats, and to be able to watch Nick Lidstrom in his own end for 2 periods it's one of the most enjoyable things I've ever had the experience to watch, just to see how he controlled the game so effortlessly. It was amazing. So I would go with Nick Lidstrom, but Paul Coffey would be a lot of fun. Ask Charlie Huddy. He had a lot of fun playing with Paul Coffey, and Big Bird Larry Robinson. He definitely would be a protector out there, and who wouldn't want to play with Bobby Orr from all the, the guy who revolutionized the rushing of a blue liner. 46 goal season one year, only topped by Paul Coffey in the 80s with 48. So have your vote at Duck Millard, Bobby Orr, Paul Coffey, Nick Lidstrom, or Larry Robinson. Who would you want to be partnered up with if you were starting your NHL career? And if you want to get in on the Ultimate Franchise Fantasy Sports League, check it out at www.uffsports.com. You own the game. And they're simming some games right now on their YouTube channel as well, pitting some of the franchises. They've loaded them all up. So if you have a team or you want to check out the league, it's really cool. It's going to be fun. It's really, really going to be exploding over the next couple of years. They're looking at other sports, possibly CFL, the Major League Baseball. Really, really, really cool. www.uffsports.com. And that'll wrap things up. Big thanks to Gerry Johannson for joining me and giving me an insight into what his players and his clients are thinking right now, and the life and times of an NHL agent. Hope you got some entertainment out of that one. Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please leave us a review. Really important. Helps us make this show a lot better, and also improves our rating out there in the podcast world. If you'd like to be a part of the program as an advertiser, please drop me an email at sportsandmorepod@gmail.com. All right, as we go, we're going to hear the huge song from Sweet Bejesus, the official band of Sports and More, the podcast. Kevin Dabbs and Christian Gutsis make up Sweet Bejesus. Their debut album, Policeman's Creek, can be found on Apple Music. So thank you very much for joining us on the program today. Enjoy your week. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay sane. More importantly, playtime is over.
All the things that grow up on the land, I could pick up with my huge hands. I could wave to someone in Yucatan if I held up my 2 huge hands. I could bury everyone in sand if I only had those 2 huge hands. Maybe I could reach you then. Maybe I could touch you again if I had 2 huge hands. Think of all the people I could meet if I only had 2 huge feet. It would take me 3 steps to get to Crete with my 2 enormous feet. Think of all the things I could crush beneath if I stamped my 2 huge feet. Maybe I could reach you then. Maybe I could please you again if I had huge feet and hands. I've been away from you too long. I hope that I can reach you with this huge song. We've been apart for some time now. My guitar was bigger, it would have huge sound. If I only had the enormous eyes, everyone would catch all of my lies. I would think that I could eat 60 pies if I had 2 huge eyes. I could see where we all go when we die if I had 2 huge eyes. Maybe I could see you then. Maybe you would love me again with my huge eyes, feet, and hands. I could break down emotional walls if I had 2 huge balls. I could float myself down Niagara Falls right on top of my huge balls. I would give 14 curtain calls if I could show off my